Arizona Territory, 1887. The desert night held its breath as the stars unveiled themselves one by one above the vast, empty landscape. Owen Emerson gripped his Winchester repeating rifle tighter as he scanned the horizon, his shadow stretching long against the sand. At 24, he had already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. The frontier had taught him one brutal lesson: attachments were deadly. Every friend he'd made since heading west had either betrayed him or died, often violently. Better to be alone than to suffer that pain again. The day a man trusts another soul out here is the day he might as well dig his own grave, he muttered to himself, adjusting his Stetson. His handsome features remained set in careful neutrality, the light stubble on his strong jawline catching the moonlight. 6 years on the frontier had hardened his body into lean muscle, but it was his eyes that told the true story: alert, wary, never resting. His ranch, if you could call it that, a small cabin with barely enough grazing land for his modest herd, sat isolated in a hidden valley. Just how he liked it. No neighbors to bother him, no town close enough to drag him into their squabbles. The nearest settlement, Copper Creek, was a day's ride away, and Owen made the journey only when absolutely necessary for supplies. Tonight's patrol wasn't strictly necessary, but the uneasiness that had plagued him since sundown demanded action. Something felt wrong in the desert air, something beyond the normal dangers of coyotes or the occasional Apache scouting party. He'd learned to trust these instincts. As Owen rounded a large boulder formation, the crack of a gunshot shattered the desert quiet. He dropped instantly, pressing himself against the rocks, heart hammering in his chest. Another shot followed, then shouting, male voices, rough and angry. Without conscious thought, Owen began moving toward the commotion, keeping low. What he saw in the small ravine ahead froze him in place. 3 men surrounded a stagecoach, 2 holding guns on the driver, while the third attempted to force open the door. Inside, visible through the window, was a young woman, her face illuminated briefly by moonlight as she backed away from the door. Owen's first instinct was to turn away. Not his problem. The frontier claimed victims every day, and getting involved only meant becoming one yourself. But something stopped him. Perhaps the desperation in the woman's face or the memory of his own sister back east whom he'd failed to protect during the war. Before he could reconsider, Owen raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. "Step away from the coach," he called out, his voice carrying across the night. "Next shot won't be a warning." The outlaws spun toward him, momentarily confused by this new threat. Owen used those precious seconds to slide behind better cover, knowing he'd just made himself a target. The driver, seeing his opportunity, suddenly produced a hidden derringer and shot one of his captors. Chaos erupted. In the confusion that followed, Owen fired twice more, dropping another bandit. The third fled into the darkness, abandoning his companions. When the dust settled, Owen approached cautiously, rifle still ready. The driver was dead, shot during the exchange. Owen moved to the coach door and pulled it open, unsure what to expect. She was younger than he'd thought, perhaps 22, with golden blonde hair that cascaded past her shoulders and eyes that seemed to challenge him even in her evident fear. Her traveling dress, once fine but now dusty from the journey, suggested Eastern wealth. "They're gone now, ma'am," Owen said stiffly, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "But we need to move. That last one might bring friends." "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than he expected. "I'm Faith Zimmerman." Owen nodded curtly, offering no introduction in return. "Can you ride?" Within minutes, he had transferred her trunk to his horse and helped her mount behind him. The desert night swallowed them as they rode away from the ambush site, leaving the stagecoach and its dead behind. "Where are we going?" she asked, her arms tentatively circling his waist as the horse navigated the rough terrain. "My place," Owen answered, immediately regretting the decision even as he made it. "Just until morning. Then I'm taking you to Copper Creek." Faith Zimmerman was running from something, or someone. The truth shimmered beneath her polite veneer like heat waves off the desert floor. Owen recognized it because he'd been running too, once upon a time. But that wasn't his concern. Tomorrow, she would become someone else's problem. As they approached his small cabin under the starlight, Owen mentally recalculated his supplies. One night of hospitality wouldn't kill him, though it certainly complicated things. The sooner she was gone, the sooner he could return to the solitude that kept him safe. What Owen couldn't know, as they dismounted before his humble home, was that Faith Zimmerman's arrival would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival on the frontier. Faith stepped cautiously into the Spartan cabin, taking in the minimal furnishings, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. No decorations softened the walls, no photographs or mementos betrayed personal connections. "It's not much," Owen said, lighting a lamp, "but it's defensible." He moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside before drawing the crude curtains. "It's more than I had an hour ago," Faith replied, removing her gloves. Up close in the lamplight, her beauty was more apparent. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of summer skies. A small scar near her right temple was the only imperfection on her otherwise flawless face. Owen cleared his throat. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep outside with the horses." "That's hardly necessary." "I can't. It's how it's going to be," he interrupted firmly. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. I'll check the perimeter." Outside in the cool night air, Owen exhaled sharply. This woman was trouble, not because of anything she'd done, but because her presence awakened something he'd worked hard to bury: basic human connection. 6 years of deliberate isolation had dulled his social instincts, but not eliminated them entirely. When he returned, Faith had removed her travel-stained jacket and washed her face. She sat at the table, her posture straight despite obvious exhaustion. "Those men," she said as he entered. "They weren't ordinary bandits, were they?" Owen set his rifle aside carefully. "Hired guns, I'd wager. They wanted something specific." "Someone specific," Faith corrected softly. "Me." The admission hung between them. Owen should have asked no further questions. Involvement meant danger, but found himself speaking anyway. "Why?" "My father was Frederick Zimmerman, the railroad investor." Owen's eyes widened slightly. Even in his isolation, he'd heard of Zimmerman's recent death and the fortune he'd left behind. "I'm his only heir," Faith continued. "There are people who believe I shouldn't live to claim my inheritance." "People with names?" "My cousin, Gregory Zimmerman. He stands to inherit everything if I disappear." Her hands trembled slightly. "I was traveling to San Francisco to meet with my father's lawyers when the stage was attacked." Owen frowned. "Copper Creek has no telegraph. Your cousin's men will assume you died in the attack until they discover otherwise." "Which gives me time to reach San Francisco," Faith finished. "That's not my concern." Owen's voice hardened. "I'll take you to Copper Creek tomorrow. You can arrange passage from there." Faith studied him for a long moment. "You go to considerable lengths to avoid human connection, Mr. Emerson." "Owen Emerson." He bristled at her observation. "Out here, connections get you killed. Or they keep you alive," she countered. "Those men would have murdered me if you hadn't helped." Owen turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get some rest, Miss Zimmerman. We leave at first light." That night, lying beneath the stars next to his tethered horse, Owen found sleep elusive. Faith Zimmerman represented everything he'd left behind: civilization, wealth, connections, complications. Yet there was something about her self-possession, her courage in the face of danger, that reminded him of the person he once was, before the war and the frontier stripped away his trust in humanity. Morning came too quickly. Owen entered his cabin to find Faith already awake, her blonde hair neatly arranged, wearing a simple riding skirt from her trunk. "I can make breakfast," she offered. "It seems a small repayment." Owen hesitated, then nodded. As Faith moved around his kitchen with unexpected competence, he found himself watching her, the graceful efficiency of her movements, the quiet determination in her eyes. "You cook well for a railroad heiress," he observed as she served a surprisingly tasty meal of fried potatoes and beans. Faith's lips curved slightly. "My father believed all women should know practical skills, regardless of wealth. He said fortune was fleeting, but capability endured." "Wise man." "He was," she agreed, a shadow crossing her features, though not wise enough to see Gregory's true nature until it was too late. They ate in companionable silence, an experience so foreign to Owen that he found himself unnerved by its normalcy. As they prepared to leave, 3 riders appeared on the horizon, approaching fast. Owen grabbed his rifle, pushing Faith behind him. "Are those your cousin's men?" Owen confirmed grimly. "They must have tracked us from the ambush site." Faith's face paled. "I've brought this to your doorstep." "No time for that now." There's a root cellar behind the stove. Get in there and stay quiet. What about you? I'll handle them. Owen checked his ammunition. Go. Now. Once Faith was hidden, Owen stepped onto his porch, rifle visible but not raised. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a classic flanking formation. Their leader, a grizzled man with a face like cured leather, reined in 20 yards from the cabin. Morning, Owen called, keeping his voice neutral. Something I can help you with. Looking for a stagecoach passenger, the leader replied. Young woman, blonde. Stagecoach was attacked last night not far from here. Terrible business, Owen said. Found the coach myself this morning on my way back from checking my herd. Driver's dead. No passengers that I saw. The leader's eyes narrowed. Mind if we look around? She might have wandered off, injured. Actually, I do mind, Owen answered, his finger moving closer to the trigger. This is private property. The tension stretched between them, fragile as spider silk. Owen knew they were calculating whether he was telling the truth and if they could take him in a fight. Finally, the leader nodded. We'll keep looking elsewhere then. Sorry to trouble you. Owen watched them ride away, not moving until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he return inside and help Faith from the cellar. They'll be back, he said flatly. With more men. Faith brushed dust from her skirt. Then Copper Creek isn't safe either. No, Owen agreed reluctantly. It isn't. You could still leave me there, Faith suggested, though her voice betrayed her fear. Wash your hands of this. Owen found himself at a crossroads. The smart choice, the choice that aligned with everything he believed about survival, was to do exactly that. Yet something deeper, something he'd thought long dead, rebelled at the thought. There's another option, he said slowly. I could take you to San Francisco myself. Faith's eyes widened. Why would you do that? It was a question Owen couldn't fully answer, even to himself. Let's just say I've got my own reasons for disliking men who think money entitles them to take lives. 2 hours later, they were traveling northwest, away from both Owen's ranch and Copper Creek. Faith rode a spare horse Owen kept for emergencies, adapting to the saddle with surprising ease. They avoided main trails, keeping to less traveled paths where pursuers would have difficulty tracking them. Have you always lived alone? Faith asked as they picked their way through a narrow canyon. Owen considered ignoring the question, but found himself answering. Not always. Fought in the war, Union side. After that, couldn't stomach being around people much. The war changed many men, Faith observed. My father employed several veterans. He said they carried wounds that never showed on the outside. Owen's jaw tightened. Some wounds are best left undisturbed. And some fester if they're not tended, she countered gently. Before Owen could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Without a word, he guided them into a narrow side passage, barely wide enough for their horses. They dismounted and pressed back against the rock wall as 6 riders passed by the main canyon, moving fast. They're casting a wide net, Owen whispered, his body unconsciously shielding Faith's. We need to be more careful. Faith nodded, her face inches from his. For a moment, something electric passed between them, a recognition that transcended their circumstances. Owen stepped back abruptly, uncomfortable with his own reaction. We'll rest here until dark, he decided. Then travel by night for a while. As the day wore on in their rocky hiding place, Owen found Faith to be a surprisingly easy companion. She didn't fill silence with needless chatter, yet when she did speak, her observations were thoughtful. She shared stories of her father, a self-made man who never forgot his humble beginnings, and asked about the land they traversed with genuine interest. By sunset, Owen realized with alarm that he was enjoying her company. The realization reinforced his determination to maintain emotional distance. Enjoyment was dangerous. It led to attachment, and attachment inevitably led to loss. When darkness fell, they continued their journey under a canopy of stars. The night desert came alive around them. The yip of coyotes, the rustling of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through cacti. Faith marveled at the beauty of it, seemingly unafraid of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Have you ever seen anything so magnificent? She asked, gesturing to the star-filled sky. Owen glanced upward. Can't say I've spent much time looking. Then you've been surrounded by wonder and missed it entirely, Faith said, her voice soft with something like pity. The observation struck Owen unexpectedly hard. Had he been so focused on survival that he'd forgotten to actually live? The thought was unsettling enough that he remained silent for several miles. They made camp in a small arroyo, building a fire small enough not to be seen from a distance. As they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Faith removed a small leather-bound book from her saddlebag. "My father's journal," she explained, catching Owen's curious glance. "He documented everything, business dealings, personal thoughts. It's why Gregory wants me dead. This contains proof of his embezzlement from the railroad company. That's why you're so determined to reach San Francisco," Owen realized. "It's not just about your inheritance." Faith nodded. "My father built that railroad with his sweat and dreams. I won't let Gregory destroy his legacy." Owen studied her in the firelight, her delicate features hardened with resolve, her hands protectively cradling the journal. For the first time, he saw beyond her beauty to the steel beneath. "You're braver than most men I've known," he admitted. A smile touched her lips. "My father said courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." As the night deepened around them, Owen found himself sharing stories he hadn't told another soul. About his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time in the war, the friend who had betrayed him during his early days out west, leading to the death of his former partner. The words came haltingly at first, then more freely, as if a dam had broken inside him. Faith listened without judgment, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. When he finished, she reached across the small space between them and briefly touched his hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. Owen withdrew his hand, uncomfortable with both the contact and his own uncharacteristic openness. "We should get some rest. I'll take first watch." As Faith settled into her bedroll, Owen positioned himself on a rock overlooking their camp, rifle across his knees. The night stretched quiet around them, but his mind was anything but peaceful. Faith Zimmerman was dismantling his carefully constructed isolation with nothing more than her presence and quiet understanding. The realization terrified him more than any physical danger. 3 days into their journey, they reached a small trading post nestled in the foothills. Owen needed to resupply and gather information about possible pursuit. Leaving Faith hidden in a copse of trees with both horses, he approached the weathered wooden structure alone. Inside, he found the usual assortment of frontier necessities: ammunition, preserved foods, basic medical supplies, and a grizzled proprietor who eyed him with the wariness common to those who survived by reading people accurately. "Just passing through," Owen explained, selecting items from the shelves. "Heading west." The proprietor nodded. "Lot of traffic these past few days. Group of fellas came through yesterday, asking about a young woman traveling alone or with a single companion." Owen kept his expression neutral. "Trouble?" "Didn't say. Offered good money for information, though." The man studied Owen carefully. "Didn't strike me as lawmen." "Appreciate the warning," Owen replied, paying for his supplies. "Any other trails west from here? Preferably less traveled." The proprietor hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "There's an old mining route through the hills. Rough going, but it'll take you to the next valley without using the main trail." He sketched a crude map on a scrap of paper. "No charge for that." Owen nodded his thanks. As he turned to leave, the door swung open and a familiar face appeared, the leader of the men who had come to his cabin. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other in mutual recognition. Then Owen dropped his supplies and drew his revolver as the other man reached for his weapon. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Owen felt the burn of a bullet grazing his left arm, but his own shot hit its mark. The gunman staggered backward, clutching his chest. Owen snatched up his supplies and ran for the door, knowing the man's companions couldn't be far. He sprinted back to Faith's hiding place, ignoring the blood soaking his sleeve. "We've been found," he gasped. "Mount up. Now." They rode hard for the foothills, following the route on the proprietor's map. Behind them, shouts and gunfire indicated their pursuers had discovered their trail. The narrow path wound through increasingly rugged terrain, forcing them to slow despite the danger at their backs. "You're bleeding," Faith called, pointing to Owen's arm. "It's nothing," he answered, though the wound throbbed with each movement. As the sun began to set, they reached a narrow gorge cut by a swiftly flowing river. The path followed the river's edge, barely wide enough for a single horse. Below, the water churned white against jagged rocks. "We need to cross before full dark," Owen decided, studying the treacherous terrain ahead. Faith nodded grimly. I'll follow your lead. They were halfway across when disaster struck. Faith's horse stepped on loose shale, its footing giving way. The animal panicked, rearing back. Faith fought to control it, but the narrow ledge offered no room for error. In horrifying slow motion, horse and rider slid toward the edge. Without thinking, Owen leaped from his own mount, lunging for Faith. His fingers closed around her wrist as her horse tumbled into the gorge below. For an eternal moment, she dangled over the precipice, her life literally in his hands. With strength born of desperation, Owen pulled her to safety, both of them collapsing on the narrow path. Faith's face was ashen, her breathing ragged. The journal, she gasped. It was in my saddlebag. The realization hit them both simultaneously. Her father's journal, the evidence against her cousin, the purpose of their dangerous journey, was gone, carried away by the river's relentless current. Owen helped Faith onto his horse, and they continued to the far side of the gorge before the light failed completely. Finding shelter in a small cave, Owen built a fire while Faith sat in shocked silence, the loss of the journal seeming to drain her usual resilience. "I've failed him," she whispered as Owen tended his injured arm. "Without that journal, Gregory wins. My father's legacy dies with him." "We don't know that," Owen argued, wrapping a bandage around his wound. "Your testimony is worthless without proof," Faith interrupted bitterly. "It's my word against his, and he has connections, influence." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should never have left Chicago. I've risked your life for nothing." Owen found himself moving to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Your father raised you to fight for what's right. That's what you're doing." "And what are you fighting for, Owen Emerson?" Faith asked softly, searching his face. "Why are you really helping me?" The question penetrated Owen's carefully maintained defenses. Why was he risking everything for this woman he'd known less than a week? The answer came with surprising clarity. "Because you remind me there might be something worth living for beyond mere survival," he admitted, the words feeling raw in his throat. Faith's eyes widened at his honesty. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with unexpected hunger from them both. Owen's arms encircled her, drawing her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, the world had shifted on its axis. Owen knew with absolute certainty that he could never return to his solitary existence, regardless of what happened next. "We should rest," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move." Faith nodded, but neither made any attempt to move away from the other. They fell asleep beside the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm protectively around her waist. Morning brought clarity and renewed determination. As they shared a meager breakfast, Faith's resourcefulness emerged once again. "I may not have the journal," she said, "but I know its contents. Every detail of Gregory's embezzlement scheme is etched in my memory. If we can reach San Francisco, I can recreate enough evidence to at least launch an investigation." Owen considered this. "We're still 3 days from the nearest railroad station, and your cousin's men are still hunting us. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are," Faith replied, a spark of her spirit returning. They continued west with their single horse, alternating between riding and walking. Owen taught Faith how to read tracks and hide their trail, while she shared stories of her father's business acumen and the railroad's construction. Each revelation deepened their connection, building a foundation of trust that neither had expected to find. That evening, as they made camp in a secluded grove, Faith asked the question that had been brewing since their kiss. "What happens after San Francisco, Owen? Do you return to your cabin and your solitude?" Owen stared into the fire, considering his answer carefully. "I don't know if I can go back to that life now." "Because of me?" Faith's voice was barely audible. "Because of what you've shown me," he corrected gently. "That the walls I built to keep pain out also kept out everything worth living for." Faith moved to kneel before him, taking his hands in hers. "When this is over, when Gregory is exposed, I'll have my inheritance, money, properties, business interests. I could go anywhere, do anything." "And what would you choose?" Owen asked, his heart beating painfully fast. "A life that means something, with someone who understands both strength and tenderness." Her eyes held his. Is that something you could want too? Before Owen could answer, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their camp. He was on his feet instantly, weapon drawn, pushing Faith behind him. 3 shadowy figures emerged from the trees, guns aimed at them. Well, ain't this touching? Drawled a familiar voice, the second in command of the men who'd been hunting them. Miss Zimmerman, your cousin sends his regards. Owen assessed their situation with growing dread. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. The men had positioned themselves carefully. No clear shot, no easy escape. Gregory won't get away with this, Faith said, her voice steady despite the danger. People know what he's done. The gunman laughed. Nobody that matters. Now, we can do this quick and clean, or we can make it last. Your choice. Owen's mind raced, searching for any advantage. His gaze fell on their small campfire, then the dry brush nearby. With a sudden movement, he kicked a burning log toward the brush, instantly igniting the dry vegetation. The distraction worked, momentarily. As the gunman instinctively backed away from the spreading flames, Owen fired, hitting one squarely in the chest. He grabbed Faith's hand, and they ran for the darkness beyond the firelight, bullets whizzing past them. They fled through unfamiliar terrain, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Owen's wounded arm hampered him, but adrenaline kept him moving. The night seemed endless, a desperate game of cat and mouse played out across the wild landscape. Dawn found them hiding in a shallow cave, exhausted and weaponless. Owen's gun had been lost during their flight. The sounds of their pursuers had faded, but both knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. I'm sorry, Owen said, his voice ragged with fatigue. I should have been more careful. Faith shook her head. You've done more than anyone could expect. More than anyone has ever done for me. In the growing light, Owen could see her clearly, dirt-smudged face, tangled hair, torn dress. Yet she had never seemed more beautiful to him. The realization that he might lose her before he'd truly found her struck him with physical pain. Faith, he began, struggling to find words for feelings he'd denied for so long. She pressed her fingers to his lips. I know, she whispered. I feel it too. The moment stretched between them, precious and fragile. Then, from outside, came the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. They've found us. Faith breathed, fear finally showing in her eyes. Owen pulled her close, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. Whatever happens, he murmured against her hair, meeting you was worth it. As footsteps approached their hiding place, Owen positioned himself between Faith and the cave entrance, determined to protect her with his last breath. But when the shadow appeared, it wasn't one of Gregory's men. It was a uniformed cavalry officer. Mr. Emerson? Miss Zimmerman, the officer called. United States Cavalry. You can come out safely. Owen hesitated, suspicious of a trap. Identify yourself properly. Lieutenant James Harrington, 7th Cavalry, came the reply. We received a telegraph from the trading post owner. Said you might need assistance. Cautiously, Owen led Faith from the cave. Outside stood a full patrol of cavalry soldiers, and the battered but very much alive trading post proprietor. Figured those men weren't up to any good, the old man explained. Sent a rider to Fort McAllister after you left. Lieutenant here was already investigating reports of hired guns operating in the territory. The lieutenant stepped forward. We've apprehended 2 armed men about a mile south of here. They had some interesting things to say about a Gregory Zimmerman and orders to eliminate his cousin. Faith sagged against Owen in relief. Then you know that Mr. Zimmerman has been using hired killers to secure an inheritance, the lieutenant finished. Yes, ma'am. We're particularly interested since one of the men killed last month was a former cavalry scout. The army takes care of its own. Owen felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. So what happens now? We escort you to the nearest telegraph office. From there, we can contact the proper authorities in Chicago and San Francisco. The lieutenant glanced between them. And get you both some medical attention. 3 days later, Owen and Faith sat together on the platform of a small railroad station, waiting for the westbound train that would take them to San Francisco. Faith wore a new dress purchased in the nearby town, her golden hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. Owen had reluctantly traded his trail clothes for a proper suit, though he'd drawn the line at relinquishing his Stetson. A telegram had confirmed that Gregory Zimmerman was already in custody, the lieutenant's report having prompted an immediate investigation. Faith's testimony would still be required, but the outcome seemed certain. "It doesn't seem real," Faith said, watching the distant plume of smoke that signaled the approaching train. "A week ago I was certain I would die in the desert." Owen took her hand, still marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "A week ago I was certain I'd live and die alone." Faith turned to face him fully. And now? The question hung between them, fraught with possibility. Owen had spent years believing that the frontier offered only two choices: isolation or vulnerability that led to destruction. Faith had shown him a third path, one where connection became strength, not weakness. "Now," he said slowly, "I'm thinking that San Francisco might be interesting for a while. But afterward—" He hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic openness. "I hear the land north of here is good for cattle. Plenty of water, good grazing. Big enough for a substantial ranch." Faith's eyes brightened with understanding. "A ranch would need proper management, someone with business experience, and someone who knows cattle," Owen added, his lips curving into a rare smile. "Cowboy," Faith said softly, her voice carrying on the desert breeze. "Do you fear me or desire me?" She searched his face in the gathering dusk, vulnerability and strength intertwined in her gaze. Owen's answer came without hesitation. "I feared what you made me feel. Now I desire nothing more than to feel it every day for the rest of my life." The train whistle sounded in the distance, heralding approach. Owen stood and offered Faith his hand, which she took with a smile that promised everything he'd never dared to want. "Then let's build something worth living for," she said. "Together." 6 months later, under a crisp autumn sky, Owen Emerson stood on the porch of a newly constructed ranch house overlooking rich grazing land in northern Arizona territory. Inside, Faith moved about the kitchen, preparing their evening meal. The sounds of cowhands returning from the range drifted up from the corrals below. The Rockingy Ranch, as they'd named it, was rapidly becoming one of the most prosperous in the territory. Faith's business acumen, combined with Owen's knowledge of cattle and the land, had proven a formidable partnership. The inheritance she'd secured after Gregory's conviction had provided the capital, but it was their shared vision that transformed those resources into something meaningful. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Faith joined Owen on the porch, slipping her arm through his. "Thinking deep thoughts, husband?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. Owen smiled, still amazed that this remarkable woman had agreed to become his wife in a simple ceremony in San Francisco before they returned to Arizona. "Just remembering who I was before you found me." Faith leaned her head against his shoulder. A lone cowboy, convinced that isolation was the only path to survival. "A fool," Owen corrected gently, "who didn't understand that survival means nothing without someone to share it with." In the distance, a rider approached, carrying mail from the nearest town. News from the outside world still reached them, but no longer seemed to hold the power it once did. They had created their own world here, one built on trust, partnership, and a love that had transformed them both. As twilight descended over their land, Owen drew Faith into his arms, marveling at how the harshness of the frontier had led him not to isolation, but to the very connection he had feared for so long. In loving Faith, he had found not weakness, but a strength greater than anything he had known before. Together, they watched the first stars appear above their home, no longer alone in the desert night.